All right, welcome back, everybody. I'm sure I scared a lot of you last week by talking about your small group deliberation project, and I don't want to scare you. So today we're going to spend a lot of our time talking about small group communication with the hope that you all won't kill each other working in small groups. We're going to talk a little bit about that project and how to make it happen. Do you have a question? Or just, oh, okay. Yep. We're going to talk about that project and how to make it happen so you don't kill each other. I'm going to give you a crash course in small group communication, which is usually a class that's offered at the university for 3 credits. I'm going to give you the short version of that course today because I think a lot of this information will help you make better deliberations. Last semester was my first time running deliberations in this class, and I have to say, at least with my lab sections, I was very, very impressed with the quality of them. So one thing that's kind of scary is that you have to do this between now and the end of the semester. The other thing that's not so scary is that's pretty much the only thing you're doing now between now and the end of the semester. So you're going to have lots of time. You're going to have lots of support from your lab instructors. I want you to make these projects as good as you possibly can, and I recognize that small group communication is challenging for a lot of people. So we're going to start off with some of my favorite quotations about small group communication. Dan Rothwell teaches small group communication. He has one of the leading textbooks on small group communication. And my favorite part of his textbook is actually the opening chapter, because he's pulled out his course evaluations from the end of the semester and pulled up the funniest things that students have said in the past about small group communication. Number 1, if God had ordered a committee to create the world, it would still be discussing proposals. In other words, small group communication is very slow and tedious and time-consuming. Number 2, for every group that I've enjoyed, there have been at least a dozen groups looking to make my life miserable and succeeding. And number 3, my favorite one, I hate groups. I hate group assignments. I hate teachers who require group assignments. Take the hint. Why you would register for a small group communication class only to complain about it at the end of the semester, I'm not so sure. I recognize, your lab instructors recognize that small group communication is not an easy thing to do. Getting people on the same page, getting them to do their part in the project, getting them to finish the project, getting everybody to have the same expectations about the project are all not easy things to do. And so I'm hoping that by the end of today, you'll have some opportunities to figure out how you're going to tackle this project and how you're going to work with people who might be a little bit difficult to work with. We've all been in groups with at least one group member who's had a hard time or given us a hard time. So I'm going to try and help you out so that the process is a little bit easier and a little bit more efficient. Before we get there, I'm actually curious about your own experience. So you can take one of these 3 prompts up on the board here, and I want you to talk to a neighbor about one of them. So these are your stories or strategies for being in groups. Well, I'm sure a lot of you have really good horror stories of things that went terribly wrong. I have some as well. You might have some success stories, and you might reflect on, what happened in those stories, and why were they more successful than the other times that I've been in small groups. Or you might, at the end of the day, have some strategies that we all can benefit from, or maybe we can at least critique and see if they're meaningful or useful strategies. So take a minute or two, talk to somebody next to you, tell them your story, your strategy, and we'll come back as a large group when you're done. I should hear lots of rumbling. It's good that I'm seeing.
I don't know. My best strategy is being very small group as and it's best to make it exclusive.
All right, I'm seeing lots of good discussion happening. Let's start out in the best place. Let's start with some horror stories. Who's got a good horror story about a group gone horribly wrong? Anybody got a good story to share with us? Anybody have any good horror stories? I know you don't. This is the quietest group I have. I'm hoping some of you will talk. I'll start off with one of my horror stories. I remember sophomore year of high school, I was supposed to give a group presentation for a class, and there were only 3 of us in the group. and the project was assigned toward the around Thanksgiving or maybe a little after Thanksgiving. We were supposed to come back after winter break and have the whole thing done. I think it was a 15-minute presentation, if I remember correctly, 10 or 15 minutes with 3 of us. And I was with these 2 girls who didn't want to do any of the work. And so we met maybe twice over winter break. They decided to gossip about each other and talk about fashion the whole time. I tried to put us back on task. They wouldn't go there with me. I really tried to fight with them a lot, and I ended up doing the whole writing of the project myself. We somehow managed to pull off an A in the class, but that took my whole winter break over one of my high school years. So that's one of my horror stories. I'm curious if any of you want to share any of yours. I know we just got started here. It also might be a good thing if we don't have horror stories, but I highly doubt that given the number of people in the room and given how difficult small group communication can be. Going once. Going twice. All right, we'll probably come back to that then. Somebody else tell me maybe then you've had some successful stories. You all have something to talk about with each other. I know it can be a little intimidating talking in front of the whole room here, but recognize again that most of the people in this room don't know your name, and there's not really a whole lot of stakes attached. So let's see if you have any good success stories or strategies for how to make small group communication go better. Yeah.
I don't have any real success stories, but what we were talking about over here as far as strategy goes is when you first meet, you pretty much establish a hierarchy within the small group that you're working on. The person who is the most invested and cares the most at the top and will set roles. And then from around, if everyone follows their roles and does what they're supposed to do, it'll go well.
Okay. So one strategy that we have for successful small group communication or group projects is to delegate roles and responsibilities. There's lots of people who have different roles that they usually play in groups. Rockwell has a whole chapter on that I'm not going to get into today, but there's a lot of people who like to take on more leadership. There are some people who'd rather be followers. There's other people who keep the group on task or at least help with social responsibility and morale. I saw another hand up here. Yeah.
I find, I don't know the like deadlines, but setting like a schedule makes it much easier.
Good, yeah, setting concrete and manageable goals for yourselves as a group. I recommended when we talked about the 5 canons to look at the 5 canons as the process for writing your speech from beginning to end. In your deliberations, you're going to be doing all 5 canons, hopefully as a group. But one of the things that I recommended when we talked about the 5 canons is to look at them backwards as well. So the frontwards way is how to do the process from beginning to end. The backwards way is to figure out how to set deadlines for yourselves. I mentioned that most of the time students often, when I have them do self-evaluation, say, I really wish I had given myself more time for memory and delivery. And the reason why that usually happens is because they procrastinate invention, arrangement, and style until the last possible second, and they're still finishing up their outlines maybe the day before or the day of their speech. You're probably going to need at least a week as a group to rehearse and practice and make sure you're all on the same page. What I really want these deliberations to be is coherent. They should be consistent across your group members, and they should help you see each other and your audience have your audience see you as a group rather than 5 or 6 individuals. Good. Any other success stories or strategies? This is all a good starting place. Yeah.
I have a senior design project that was a year long, and it was 3 of us.
Okay.
And even though we had like one kind of slacker of the group, we still like it worked out all right.
Okay.
We kind of gave them like guidelines.
Yeah.
But at the end of like the project, like there's no way we could have done it like just one of us.
Okay. Fair enough.
Like a group effort.
So I hear lots of good things there. One good thing is that even though they had someone in their group who wasn't really pulling their weight, she said that they weren't able to do the project without every single person. Even that one person who wasn't pulling all of their weight, they gave them concrete tasks and had that person do those concrete tasks, and had that person not done those, it probably would have not succeeded as well as it did. But when you have someone who looks like they're slipping, we're going to call it social loafing later today, if it looks like somebody's not doing their job, really checking in with that person can make a difference. Good. Anything else? Yeah.
Plan A, hope you get good numbers, and then if you have to resort to plan B, take absolute control, leave nothing to chance, and throw anyone underperforming under the bus.
Oh, okay. So I heard a lot of things there. One is hope that you get good group members, and sometimes you get to choose your own groups. Most of the time that ends as soon as you graduate. So when you go into the real world, as I like to refer to it, whatever that means, when you go into the real world, you very rarely get a chance to choose who your group members are. You're hired on with particular coworkers, and those are your group members. And so some of you are going to go into a project and think that you're working really well with the group. Sometimes even when you choose your own group members, it doesn't go as planned, and you're probably going to run into difficult people. Now, this gentleman said, you know, if somebody is not really working, his strategy is to throw those people under the bus and maybe report them to an authority figure of some kind. We're going to talk a little bit today about how the project is going to be set up. I know that when I teach the deliberation speech, I have a group grade and I have a separate individual grade, and I have my group members report how the process went and who did what. I would encourage you as much as possible to document that process. Show your work, show how much you've done, show the emails that you sent to somebody, and show that they never responded to those emails. Whatever it may be, the more documentation you have, the more you're kind of covering your own, you can fill in the blank there, you're covering your own butts to make sure that you are all safe. Any other thoughts, strategies, horror stories, anything we want to share just kind of collectively based on our experience? I think your experience counts for a lot here. All right, we'll go ahead and move on then. So that will take us to our participation question for the day. Again, remember that you need your lab instructor's name, your section number, and your response to the question above. So I'm going to ask you, just based on your own experience or your own thoughts, which of the following do you think is true about small group communication? This is the kind of question that could show up on your final exam. Remember, your final is comprehensive. Hopefully it won't be necessarily this tricky, and you'll have the tools to make sure that you do it well. Go ahead and take out a sheet of paper, put your name, your lab instructor's name, your section number, and finally your answer to this question. And you can hold on to those again. We'll have you turn them in at the end of class. Option A, effective small group communication always avoids conflict. Option B, majority rule is not always the best decision-making process. Option C, more group communication is always better communication. Option D, relationship goals among members are unimportant as long as the task gets done. So go ahead and write your name, your lab instructor's name, your lab section number, and finally your answer. Does anybody need more time with that one? Take another 30 seconds or so. And I'll just have you shout out your answer when you're ready. Go ahead and shout out which answer you picked, and I'll listen for it.
B.
I hear a lot of B's. Anybody say anything other than B? We've got some C's, we've got some A's, we've got some D's. We're not really sure. I will tell you the correct answer here is B. A lot of people really like majority rule. We're going to talk about different decision-making strategies that you might use and some of the pros and cons of those. We're also going to debunk some of these other myths that stand out about small group communication. There are lots of people who have lots of bad things to say about it, kind of like when people tell you, oh, you're taking public speaking. All you need to know is picture your audience in their underwear, which is the first thing I told you not to do, right? There's lots of misconceptions about how small group communication works. I'm going to tackle the first one here. That was answer A for any of you who said that good communication always avoids conflict. I'll tell you that that's a very Minnesota or North Dakota nice way of looking at small group communication. It's very rare that a group that avoids conflict is a thing that exists when you're in a small group. In fact, there have been lots of studies about the different phases that groups go through. This one here is coming from Paul Tuchman, who was a social communication scholar. He came up with 4 main phases that groups go through and talked about them as natural phases for groups to experience. And he talks about them in order, and they all happen to rhyme, which makes it easier to remember them. But he added a 5th one that doesn't rhyme later on. The 5th one that he said is adjourn. At some point, groups dissolve, and they no longer function as a group. But the 4 phases that he talks about are forming, storming, norming, and performing. Forming is when your group just meets for the first time, and maybe you already know each other, but maybe you don't know each other in the context of the task that you've taken on, or maybe you don't know that much about each other. Sometimes you don't know anything about each other. And so the forming is just the initial phase of deciding, hey, it's probably a good idea, or maybe we're required to work as a group for some kind of assignment or some kind of task. And so it's the initial process of just meeting and getting to know each other. That's the early phase, and these aren't necessarily linear, but that one's usually the first one for a lot of groups. The second phase that Tuckman talks about is the storming phase. And he said it's actually very natural and normal for groups to experience conflict. It's very common for groups to not get along and not see eye to eye. When we're talking about small groups, usually we're talking about groups the size of anything from 3 to 20. It's very rare to get 3 people on the same page about anything, let alone 15, 16, or 20 of them. It's actually pretty normal for groups to go through conflict, and it may actually be a good thing. A few years ago when I was in graduate school, I took an upper-level graduate seminar on communication and conflict, and even among the graduate students, my professor spent the entire semester trying to convince us conflict is actually a good thing sometimes. It was even difficult for some of us as graduate students to accept that lesson. There's a lot of value that comes in going through that storming phase. A lot of times we have different people with different things, different skill sets, different values, different beliefs, different practices, different experiences to bring to the table. And sometimes we get caught up in just this mindset that says we all have to agree all of the time. But if you have something special to bring to the table and something that somebody hasn't thought of already, sometimes it can actually be good to raise that there's an issue that we all need to address. If the group's heading off a cliff, somebody is probably going to be wise to start putting the brakes on and yelling for help, right? This is the standard. It's pretty common for groups to experience some kind of conflict phase, and it's not always a bad thing. Part of why it's not always a bad thing is because of that third phase here, norming. Norming means we're trying to figure out what should be the task that we need to do, or what should be the thing that we need to recalibrate. Oftentimes when we have that conflict phase, it feels like people are going in 30 different directions and somebody's going to storm out of the room and yell. Sometimes that does actually happen, but at some point we have to get back and get everybody back on the same page. That norming phase is about recalibrating our relationship to each other and also about recalibrating our relationship to the task. And so we're trying to figure out if a bunch of people have a bunch of different ideas and the emotions in the room are getting pretty heated, how do we get everybody back into the same place? Well, often it happens through discussion. It's very rare for groups to be able to go through the norming phase without experiencing the storming phase first. At some point, there are going to be disagreements, and some of them are more important than others, and some of them are more long-lasting than others. It's important that you are able to get back to that norming phase, and sometimes groups will go directly from forming to norming, and the storming won't happen until later, but it still happens, and so you have to prepare for it. If you make it through your entire small group deliberation and don't go through the storming phase, good for you. You're probably one of the rare groups in this room that's going to be able to do that, and it might be that some people, maybe you could have had a better project if other people had spoken up a little bit more. These aren't necessarily a linear process, but a lot of you will probably go through that storming phase. And when you do, it can be really good for helping you get on the same page, and your group after the norming process might get along better and also might be more efficient in carrying out the task that you're trying to do. Ultimately, the last phase, the ideal phase for groups, is to get to the performing stage, and that's when you're actually doing the work that you need to be doing and hopefully doing it well. The whole idea of small group communication is that a lot of us have individual skills and individual experience that can help us become good at the task that we're taking on. But sometimes when we share the burden, we can make the task easier and get it done faster. Sometimes we can also get it done better. Sometimes we also have a project that's a little too big for any one of us to take on individually. So it's important that we're able to get from that forming stage of just meeting to that performing stage of really doing the best that we possibly can. On the way to that, you might encounter some storming. You're probably going to encounter some norming. You're going to have to figure out how you're going to do what you're going to do. And so I'm going to encourage your lab instructors to help you strategize how to figure out how to delegate tasks, how to delegate roles, how to figure out how you're going to tackle this so that the project itself is manageable. There's another big theme that comes up in small group communication literature a lot, and that is that sometimes groups are about tasks and sometimes groups are about relationships. So sometimes we want to get things done, other times we just want to, have fun with each other and just get along. I'm curious, I didn't fill in the graph here yet. what do you think is the relationship between group cohesion, that is how well your group gets along, and how productive you are? Anybody want to take a guess? I do have a right or wrong answer, but it's okay to guess. It's probably a good thing that you try it out. Anybody want to guess? The more your group is cohesive, the more you get along. Do you think you're more productive as a result?
No,
No. Why do you say no?
because you're all going to be hanging out and having fun instead of working on your project.
Okay, so there's a moment where sometimes you are just having fun and you get distracted. It's kind of like that story I told of my horror story. Sometimes people are just having fun and they never focus on the task that they're supposed to get done. Would anybody venture that maybe as your group gets to know each other and gets along better, that you actually do perform better and you do get more stuff done? Is there a point where that happens? I see a couple of head nods. I heard a yes. Somebody want to weigh in? Why do you think it might be that if groups get along well, that they might be able to work better as a team and get more done?
People communicate better with those they are familiar and comfortable with.
Okay, good. So if I don't know you, I have to get to know you. I have to trust you. If I trust you, I can probably communicate more effectively and more efficiently with you. And so if I have a task to do, I can't just walk up to you, not know your name, and say, here, you, do this, right? We have to spend some time building that trust with each other, trying to figure out what our strengths and weaknesses are and how we're going to incorporate it into the task. So we've got some people saying yes, some people saying no. What do you think? Anybody else want to weigh in? Maybe there's, if you were to draw this graph, oh, I just did it. There we go. We'll go back to it. It's actually what social scientists call a curvilinear relationship. That is, it actually works up until a point, and then, like the gentleman over there was saying, eventually it becomes not so productive and you don't get stuff done. So it's actually the case that both are true. As your group gets more cohesive, as you get to know each other, you should be able to get a little bit more done up until a certain point. But if you spend so much time on your relationship, then the task gets lost in it. A lot of people think that small group communication is all task-oriented, that you only can be part of a group in order to get something done. It's actually the case that relationships are very important, and that groups that don't take the time to get to know each other, groups that don't get along, groups that don't trust each other end up really struggling with the task as well. And so sometimes if you find that you've had a couple of group meetings and they've been unproductive, part of what might be going on here is that somebody feels like they are being left out of the group. Somebody might feel like they don't have anything to contribute. And so it's important for you to make sure that when you're falling off task, you also check your relationships with one another. If you're all task-oriented right from the get-go, you're likely to enter into that storming phase pretty quickly. If you're all relationship phase from the get-go, you might not ever get to the task. And so I want you to be able to manage both of those poles. They're both important, and you want to be in that spot right in the middle, where your group gets along, but you're also not just talking about things like the weather or your sports teams or fashion or whatever it may be, but that you can actually get each other back to your task when you need to be back on task, and you can have that relationship with each other so that you all get along. Now, the other answer that some of you said was that majority rule is always the best strategy. We live in a democracy, we're accustomed to majority rule. We're going to talk about a couple of different decision-making strategies that you all might use in your groups. Chances are you will use all three of these decision-making strategies at some point. The first one is what we often think of and kind of the default for a lot of people living in a democracy, and that's majority rule. A lot of people think that if we just take a vote and it's 4-2, then that decides it for us and we can move on. We can probably think of some pros for that. Most of the time, we can't necessarily agree on everything, and so majority rule is at least a democratic process. It at least helps us figure out how to make arguments with one another and how to resolve arguments. At some point, we just got to take a vote, and we got to figure it out. One of the big cons with majority rule is that it's always presumed to be a good thing, especially in democracies. Majority rule can actually be really problematic. It can, one of the biggest problems with it is it can make members of the minority feel like they've been outnumbered, that their voices aren't being heard. Majority rule is one of those things that can actually really badly throw off a task. And when I'm talking about minorities, I don't mean demographic minorities, but I mean the people who didn't get their way. The people who were on the losing side of that vote might still be fuming about it. They might think their idea is still right, and they might actually be right that their idea was right, but the other group voted them down. And so they just shut down and they don't talk anymore. That's one of the big things to be very leery of when we're talking about majority rule. The best use of majority rule, according to a lot of small group communication literature, is for a task that's not a whole lot, a task that's not very important, but one that needs to be decided quickly. Sometimes we just need to take a vote so that we can move on, because otherwise we can talk until the cows come home. The other way that majority rule can be really helpful is when you don't need unanimity or consensus. If we don't need to all agree on whatever it is that we're doing, we can move pretty quickly through it. The second strategy that you can talk about is minority rule. And minority rule happens when you have a very strong leader and a lot of people in the group who are comfortable being followers or maybe just uncomfortable challenging that leader. One of my favorite stories to tell about minority rule is that I was in a fraternity as an undergrad, and one of my friends was the fraternity president when I came in. I didn't have the chance to vote for him because I was a first-year student. I went to him. We had elections for the president who would be in charge the next year. And this president, who was a friend of mine, was very accustomed to making decisions by minority rule. It was pretty much all the decisions were left up to him, and he was getting really annoyed by the fact that other people weren't helping him make decisions. And so we voted, we elected a new president, and I asked him for a small task of some kind, and I don't remember what it was, but his response to me was, well, you can direct that straight to the department of, that's not my problem anymore. Meaning that he had been the minority running the show for so long that he was kind of exhausted from doing it. So you can probably guess what the downside is from that, but the upside of it is that it relieves a lot of those members in the group who don't want to lead. Sometimes you get a group of 4 people and you're like, who's going to lead us? And you don't have a leader. And so you storm over who's going to lead, and it's kind of this nose game of you go first, no, you go first. Somebody will eventually take on that leadership role, and if you have a very passive group, this is one way to break it, is to put someone in charge and have them making decisions. Just because that person is in charge doesn't mean that they have to stay in charge, but it's a way to get you motivated. One of the cons is that it can lead to power struggles. You all probably seen authoritarian minority leaders who like it's their way or the highway. And the rest of the group gets really annoyed with them, and they get annoyed with the rest of the group because nobody else took on the leadership role. So we have a power struggle going on between the leader and the members who aren't doing much, and that can lead to kind of a stalemate. The best use of minority rule is when you have a strong leader who can make fair decisions, and that fair decisions part is key here. We want to make sure that the leader is not just acting in their own best interest, because a lot of us are selfish. A lot of us are self-centered in the way that I talked about when we talked about audience analysis. You want to make sure that if you have a good leader, that they're actually a benevolent dictator, if they're going to be a dictator at all. The third strategy that you could use, and that a lot of you will try to use, is unanimity. Unanimity is about the consensus building. It's getting everyone on the same page. So you take a vote, and if it's 4-2 or even 5-1, you still work on it until you have consensus across everybody. If you've ever seen 12 Angry Men, if you had to watch 12 Angry Men in high school, you know what this process looks like. It's about making sure that it's a 6-0 vote and not a 5-1 or 4-2 or whatever split you may have. The pros of consensus building is that it often leads to better decisions. When everybody's on the same page, we can then say, you all voted, this is what we decided, we all came to this for a reason, and we can kind of live together or die together based on what we've decided. One of the cons of it is it can be really difficult and really time-consuming. So getting consensus, if you've seen 12 Angry Men again, can take days. It can take weeks. Sometimes you might not ever get there. But one of the big pros of this decision-making style is that oftentimes everybody is satisfied with the conclusion that you draw. And so a lot of small group communication textbooks say that when you can make decisions based on unanimity or consensus, that's the best of these 3 strategies. When we have something that's really important, when we're in a small group and we have time to discuss it, it's easier for us to get to unanimity. It actually kind of prevents that storming phase. We probably had to go through a storming phase or 2 or 7 to get to unanimity. But when we do, groups almost consistently across the board rank it as the most satisfactory outcome. They're usually very pleased with themselves when they can make unanimous decisions. Now, the other thing that we have here, another problem that can come with unanimity is so-called groupthink. I'm curious if any of you have heard this term groupthink before. This is another one of the big downsides of unanimous decision-making. What is groupthink?
You have like one person with a bad idea that's really forceful about it.
Uh-huh.
And get everyone else on board.
Good, yeah. One way of thinking about it is if you have one person with a really bad idea, but they're really vehement, really passionate about that bad idea, they can get everyone else on board. There's actually a little bit more to groupthink than just that, but that's a really good starting place. One of the big concerns about groupthink is that it's consensus, but it's a fake kind of consensus. It's consensus where people say that they all agree and they'll head nod verbally, or they'll say, yes, I agree to that, or they'll raise their hands in favor, right? Everybody agrees, except the people are not saying what they're actually thinking. This is another one of those things that can be really dangerous about that Minnesota, North Dakota nice mentality. We don't like challenging authority. We don't like being controversial. We don't like the idea of getting the rest of the group mad at us. What groupthink is essentially a fake consensus that says we're saying we're all on the same page, but we're not all actually on the same page. What do you think might be problematic about that? Why might groupthink be something that you would want to avoid in a small group? It seems like a really good thing. We're all on the same page. Why might it not be a good thing? We've got quiet again. Talk to a neighbor. Why do you think groupthink might be a bad thing? Share it with a neighbor. All right, see, you all have ideas. You just don't want to share them in the room of 300 people. Somebody be brave. Yeah, there we go.
I mean, it just lead to really bad decisions.
Yeah, sometimes groupthink can lead to very, very bad decisions, right? Sometimes that groupthink is that unanimity that drives the whole group off the cliff. Are there other reasons why groupthink might be a thing to avoid?
Yeah, if it's not something that you're interested in, you're not going to, have a passion for whatever.
Yeah, if you don't really care about it, you've just signed yourself into a contract of something that you don't want to do. Something that you might be personally opposed to, that you might have ethical or practical dilemmas that mean, I can't do the thing that you're asking me to do, but I just agreed to do it. Most of the time when we have groupthink, it's because people are afraid to question authority. It's because people are afraid to be the controversial one in the group. Sometimes groups really need that controversial figure to stand up and be the annoying one and say, hey, I'm not sure that this is doing what we want it to do. Or I'm not sure that this is the best plan that we have. We think we're all on the same page, but we're not all actually on the same page. Another good thing that we talk about with small group communication is what's called synergy. For a lot of people, this is why you do small group communication in the first place. We all have individual strengths, we all have individual goals and ideas that we bring to the table. Sometimes group projects are bigger than things that we can take on ourselves. I like the metaphor of the puzzle. Each of you is a puzzle piece, and you might have to, jam yourselves into the group, or you might have to cut off one of your parts to make sure that you fit. But somehow we're going to get these puzzle pieces to fit together, and when we do, look at this beautiful puzzle that we've all created. Synergy is the idea that when groups function well, the whole is better than the sum of any of its individual parts. So if I have 4 people doing 4 individual projects that are all 20 minutes long, those projects might not be very good if I don't give you a whole lot of time to do them. But if I have 4 of you giving a 20-minute presentation, and each of you takes on 5 minutes of that presentation, and you've got 3 weeks to do it, that usually works pretty well, and you can actually be very surprised by the things that you'll be able to get done together. There's a cautionary flip side to this, and that cautionary flip side is what's called negative synergy. That is, sometimes the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, but it's greater in the sense that everybody's individual complaints and grievances get in the way and end up dragging the group down. This is kind of like thinking in terms of dominoes. You got one bad apple who gets really cranky about what the group is doing. They start complaining, somebody else starts complaining, somebody else starts complaining. Initially, it seems like lighthearted fun. You're complaining about your lab instructor, you're complaining about me, you're complaining about the assignment. Eventually, what it leads to is people not doing the assignment at all because you get so bored and jaded with it. I want to make sure that you don't fall into this pattern of negative synergy, and this is where relationships come back in. If you're only focused on the task, it's really easy for this negative synergy to set in because nobody gets along, nobody wants to do the thing that you're doing, and it's much easier for you to tear each other down than to build each other up. Some of your groups are going to encounter this semester, and I'm sorry that that's the case, because not only is it going to result in a bad experience for you, but you're probably not going to get a very good grade on your project at the end of the semester. There's another concept that I want you all to be aware of, and this concept is called social loafing. Social loafing is essentially being that guy who doesn't participate in the project, guy or girl, who doesn't participate in the project because everybody else will pick up the parts. can't someone else do it? The metaphor that I like to give for this is if we're all going to lift this table, right? Some of us are lifting with our knees and our backs, and we're actually lifting the table. And there's always one person who's just kind of standing there, not doing anything. Looks like they're working, but they could easily come or go. They're not really part of the group. They're not doing the heavy lifting. Social loafing often happens because the social loafer doesn't feel included, doesn't feel like they have anything to contribute. There's a lot of people who like to blame the social loafer for the fact that they are socially loafing, the fact that they're not pulling their weight or not doing their part for the rest of the group. It's very easy for people to blame that person and say it's entirely that person's fault. Sometimes that is the case. Maybe somebody has some life circumstances that are going on that make it difficult. I'm not kidding. Some of my friends like to tease undergrads about how they will joke that they have 15 grandmothers who die right before a big project is due. I actually had 2 grandparents and a family friend die within a week of each other when I was working on a group project as an undergrad. True story. Well, my father's father, my mother's mother, and then a family friend all passed away within a week of each other. I was in the group. I still managed to do my part for the group, but I also let the group know what was going on. Sometimes people are just lazy. Sometimes people are just incompetent. But a lot of the small group communication literature actually has talked to people who are in groups where social loafing happens. And usually if they talk to the social loafer after the fact, they say they felt like they weren't included. They felt like the other group members didn't care about them. They felt like it was not really important whether they were there or not because nobody noticed what they were doing when they were there. And so this is, again, where that relationship component can really be important here. I'm going to first ask you not to be that guy or girl who doesn't pull their weight, but I'm also going to ask you that if you notice somebody in your group having a hard time, try reaching out to that person first. Reach out to them more than once and more than just one way to make sure that they feel included and to let them know that they're valued and that they can contribute to part of the project. Now, some of you have also seen this other cautionary tale about social loafing. This is a little story or poem that circulates a lot on the internet. It's a big thing in business meetings. I'll just let you take a second to read that. Short story about 4 people named Everybody, Anybody, Somebody, and Nobody. This is how a lot of groups go when we're talking about social loafing. Be wary of that cautionary sentence at the end. It's often the case with small groups that everybody thinks somebody is going to do something and nobody actually ends up doing it. And then you all get mad at each other because anybody could have done the thing that you said you were going to do, but it's deadline time and you're all up at 2 in the morning trying to finish your project for tomorrow. Again, make sure that you work backwards. Make sure that everybody has a role. Make sure that you're upfront about your goals and when and how you're going to accomplish those goals. So I'm just going to talk to you today, again, trying to calm some of your nerves about this small group deliberation process. I've given you a lot to think about today. Some of you might have been familiar with some of this theory before. Some of you might not be very familiar with it. Your expectations for this project, like I said last week, is that you're usually going to be working in small groups of 6 to 8 individuals. The reason for that is that a lot of small group communication literature has also studied what is the best size for a group to be functional. And the number, like I said, any group that the literature refers to as a small group is usually between 3 and 20 students. They actually found that there's a size that is the optimal size for a group where they're less likely to kill each other. And that number is 7. So I went 1 on either side to make sure that you all have roughly 7, and you can have the most productive group that you can have. The 7 of you, or the 6 or 8 of you, are going to be giving a 20-minute presentation. If you do the math, that means maybe 2 or 3 minutes per person if you're all speaking evenly, plus a couple of minutes of Q&A. This is your opportunity to deliver your speech to a full class. Up until this point, you've been using GoReact to record with each other. You've been doing that in small groups. Your whole group is going to be presenting to a larger audience than you're used to. So your part's a little bit higher stakes this time, and that's part of why I'm okay with it. The other reason I'm okay with it is because, like I said earlier, all 5 of you, or all 7 of you, or however many there are going to be doing the 5 canons together. It's not going to work very well if one person does all the invention work and does all the research, and then another person does all the arrangement and style, and then they just give you a manuscript and you all figure out memory and delivery from it. You're not going to be very satisfied with that process, and so part of what's challenging about this assignment is that you're working in small groups together. You should be working together for all parts of that. Now, my online class is doing this a little bit differently. Because online communication is much harder, I'm only having them in groups of 3 or 4. But their presentations are a little bit shorter than yours, and that's what they're expected to do. What you're going to be doing for this project is you're going to be giving a problem solution speech. This is why we spent all that time a few weeks ago talking about stasis theory, talking about claims, evidence, and reasoning. Your thesis statement for this project is ultimately going to be some governing body should, and then some specific policy that they should do. To get to that thesis statement, you as a group are going to have to explore a couple different options. So you're going to decide together as a group, what is a problem out there in politics or in communities that we're having trouble solving? What's some problem out there in the world that we're not happy with? You as a group first have to agree on what problem you're going to look at, and then you have to look at possible solutions to that problem. The goal of deliberation isn't always to come up with one right or wrong answer, but it's to explore a couple different possibilities so that you can come up with the best one that you think is the best of the bad options a lot of the time, or at least the best available option that you do have. So you're going to, as a group, come up with your problem. You're going to come up with, in my online class, 1 to 2 or 2 to 3 solutions. In my face-to-face classes, 3 or 4 solutions. So someone's going to introduce the speech. They're going to introduce the problem. Somebody else is likely to take 1 or 2 of those solutions, right? You'll go down the line, and over the progression of your speech, you'll have introduction, problem, 3 to 4 solutions, best available solution, conclusion. Ultimately, what you're trying to do is convince your audience that the best available option is the one of the 3 or 4 that you chose, and they're going to challenge you on that. Someone might, in your audience during Q&A, raise their hand and say, you know, you gave 3 different options. I really liked option 1, but your group chose option 3. And they'll give their reasoning for that, and you should be prepared to defend that. Maybe you give 3 or 4 options, and someone in your audience raises their hand and says, you know, I'm not really satisfied with any of these options, but I'm going to provide my own option 5. Those are things that you have to think about. Those are things that you, as a group, should be prepared to tackle. It's important that you learn how to do good Q&A, because there's a lot of people who do really bad Q&A. And I want you to get good at that, but you also can remember that you can rely on your group mates when you're doing that. I also want to remind you that I gave you a policy proposals handout. That policy proposals handout is a lot of things that people generally ask during Q&A sessions. One of the big ones is usually, where is the money going to come from for this? Do we have to raise taxes? Do we have to cut services elsewhere? Is this policy feasible? Is this policy fair? You'll want to go back to that policy proposals handout, because that's going to help you make your decision and ultimately figure out what you're going to say. Deliberation, when we're conceiving of it, is usually more of a product than a process. So I want this to be both. You're going through a process as a small group. Usually when we have deliberation, we have large groups. You're going to have both product and process aspects of this. So the product is that you're ultimately giving a group speech together. That product won't be any good unless the process of you all working together as a group is already in place. So I've got a couple recommendations for you to help you not kill each other. The first recommendation I have is to make sure that you get an early start. There's a reason why I'm starting this now. For a lot of you, these aren't due for a couple of weeks, but they are coming due right around finals time. And so you have to be prepared for how you're going to navigate this project and your projects for your other classes. Another thing is to get to know your group members. Go through that forming stage and give yourself some time to do that forming stage. In your lab sections, there are usually 38 of you. You probably know some people in there pretty well. You probably don't know other people in there very well. Even if you know people in your group very well, still take the time to get to know each other. Get to know your interests. Get to know your skill sets. Get to know the things that you find important. It's going to be very difficult for you to get the task done if you don't have that initial trust. And so I'd encourage you in one of your early meetings to just get together for coffee or get together for a meal somewhere and talk to each other, because it's really difficult to focus on what you need to do unless that initial trust is there. Those relationships are much more important than you think. And maybe toward the end of one of your first meetings, you can finally start brainstorming, okay, how are we going to actually do this thing? Another recommendation I have for you is for all of you to be as clear as possible about the expectations. One of the biggest comments that I write on student work, and I hate writing it every time it happens, is, You didn't meet the assignment, right? Your lab instructors will give you exactly what they're looking for. Make sure that you read the assignment prompt and what generally the assignment is about. Make sure that you've read the rubric to know that know what you're being evaluated on. Be clear with each other about what the assignment expectations are and how you're going to meet those. It's also really important to be together on expectations about the group's responsibilities. Different people like to fall into different roles, and some people might take on more leadership in one area and might step back in another. You all are going to have to figure out your puzzle pieces and how they're going to fit together, and a lot of that has to do with being explicit and upfront about what you want to do and what you don't like doing. Related to that, you want to make sure that you're not the social loafer in the group who's not doing their part. If everybody in the group has explicitly laid out expectations, then you should be able to know what your role is and be able to do it. Whenever possible, I recommend that you get that in writing. That way, if somebody doesn't do their part, you can say, you signed off to do this thing and you didn't do it, and so now we're going to have to do it for you. Remember that social loafing is rarely just someone being lazy or someone being just not participating. Oftentimes, social loafing is a group responsibility, and the more you check in with each other, the more regularly you check in with each other, the better off you're going to be. I want to suggest also that whenever you meet, you try to meet in person. There's this big kind of mentality around undergrads right now that we can just get everything done with Google Docs, or we can get everything done over Skype, or whatever it may be. I'm going to tell you that when I took small group communication as an undergrad, the internet was still fairly new, but we had a project where we had to plan a 3-week-long trip to some country in Europe as a group. And the only condition that my professor gave us for that group project was you cannot plan any of this trip face-to-face. You can only plan it online, and you have to show me the transcript of all your online interactions. And I'll tell you that that was the single hardest project that we had in that class all semester, and the reason for that is because online communication usually doesn't work all that well. One of the main reasons why online communication is not particularly good for small group communication is that it's asynchronous. That means that the communication is not all happening at the same time. If you've ever seen synchronized swimmers, they're all moving the exact same motions at the same time. Your group should be functioning kind of like synchronized swimmers. What's going to happen is if you're meeting online, somebody's not going to show up to the group meeting, somebody's not going to respond to an email, somebody's not going to get in touch with the group for 3 days or a week or 2 weeks. I want to make sure that you're all touching base as much as possible. The more you can do that face-to-face, the better. The main recommendation I have for you is that you should strive to function together as a team and not as 6 to 8 individuals. It's very obvious to your instructor, it's very obvious to the rest of your classmates if you've prepared a group presentation that you haven't practiced as a group. And suddenly you're just passing down the line from one person to the next, and there's no real sense of arrangement, there's no real coherence, there's no beginning to middle or end. Somebody in the group looks at somebody else and says, what? You're talking about what now? That's not what we agreed on, right? In the middle of your presentation. That's what you don't want. And so the more you can be on the same page about all 5 of the canons, the better off you're going to be. I say all of this to make your lives easier. I'm trying to get it to a place where you don't all kill each other. I've given you a lot of time in your lab sections to work on this project, and so I'm going to encourage you to do the best that you can. I'm going to try and inspire you. If you encounter any kind of trouble with your group mates, the best thing you can do is document your interactions. Show the proof that you tried to email this person and they never responded. Show the proof that you did all the work, or you did 20% of the work. Your lab instructor is probably going to have a combination of a group grade and an individual grade, but I would touch base because each lab instructor grade is a little bit different. So I'll leave you with that and wish you good luck. You all can do this. You're going to do well on it. Go ahead and turn in your participation questions to the folder up here, and I'll see you next week.